Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. This is your chance to discover some of Concordia's top leading academics, some who are making news around the world. I'm Caroline Locker and I'll be hosting these conversations. Today, we're talking about child learning. So, as parents, we all want the very best education for our children, of course. But what if that education isn't found at school? In Canada, you can choose to educate your children at home. In fact, it's estimated about 1% of all Canadian children are homeschooled. In Sweden or Germany, for example, that's illegal. You have to send your children to school. But in America, it's quite popular to homeschool your children. In fact, about 1.5 million American children are homeschooled. So, which children learn better? Those who are taught in the public school or those who are taught at home? In fact, there's been very little scientific research on the topic up until now, and that's where we're very pleased to have with us Professor Sandra Martin-Chang of Concordia's Department of Education. Welcome. Thank you very much for being with us. Also joining me is Wendi Hadd, who's a mother of 6 and who has decided to homeschool all of her children. Wendy's also a teacher. She teaches at John Abbott College here in Montreal. Welcome, Wendi. Nice to have you. So, in a moment, we'll see how widely debated this topic can be. And we'll find out from our guest if or not it's controversial. But first, I'd like to know, Professor Martin-Chang, how did you first decide to do scientific research on homeschooling?
Well, at the time I was working at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, and my sister-in-law homeschools her 6 children, actually. And there had been some discussion about her decision to homeschool, which I was very much in favor of. And so I just was looking in the literature to see what we knew about homeschooling. And I found that there was a real lack of literature on how children performed academically, children who had been homeschooled. So, being a scientist, I decided to ask the question myself.
You took it upon yourself to find those answers.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And Wendi, as we get started, can you first just explain why you chose to homeschool your children?
I really didn't choose to homeschool my children in reaction to the public school system. I think it's really important to say that, because I know there are a lot of people who homeschool for excellence, that they believe that they can do so much better than the public school system. The public school system is failing. But I chose to homeschool my children because I wanted to spend more time with them. So I really approached it from that perspective, that we were going to be all together, that I would spend much more time with them, that I would be more influential in their lives than either teachers or their peers. So that really was the beginning of it.
And you've homeschooled all of your children?
Yes.
For how long?
Well, probably about 20 years now. I started about 20 years ago with my eldest. So yeah, it's been...
So how long were they homeschooled for? Through primary school and high school?
Yes, all of them. Yeah, and my second eldest is going to be in CEGEP in the fall. So that'll be the first time that he's actually in an institution for school.
And did you do it all on your own, or did you share the teaching with someone else?
Really, it fluctuated from one year to the other. When they were very little, I had a lot of friends who were homeschooling, and we would often sort of arrange to look after, just like babysitting services kind of thing. And but mostly we did it on our own. It's homeschooling is kind of like a Saturday. Every day is Saturday, and so you're at home and you're doing whatever that you need to be doing that day.
That's a nice way to see it.
Yeah.
Sandra Martin-Chang, is that a common reason that parents give for deciding to homeschool their children, that they simply want to spend more time with them?
That is one of the main reasons, yes, but I've also heard many people speak of religious reasons, as well as some are dissatisfied or a little bit frightened of what could be happening in the school system. So
for example?
For example, bullying. I've heard bullying come up often as a reason not to necessarily send your children to school. A hidden curriculum, I've heard that come up as a reason. So parents who don't necessarily want their children to be exposed to different gender stereotypes or Barbie dolls, so I've heard those things come up.
Definitely.
Does that resonate for you as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's why I always, when I tell people, I always state from the beginning that I don't have, I have concerns with the public school system, but I'm not sort of slagging the public school system. That's not one of the reasons that I chose, but those are a lot of reasons that people give, particularly religious reasons.
I was about to say though that the demographic that we worked with had not started in the public school system and then opted out. I think there were probably that might be a different population who had, let's say, sent their children to school until grade 2 and then decided
took them out in reaction to something that happened.
So the parents that I spent some time speaking with, they were perhaps in fear of things that they hadn't experienced themselves in public school.
Okay.
So
now you've identified in your research 2 types of homeschooling, and I think it's important that we clarify the difference from the start. Can you explain them?
Well, originally, when I got into this research, I was planning on just studying, homeschoolers. But I quickly came to discover that within the demographic that chooses to educate at home, there were many different types. First of all, almost every family was different. But there seemed to be a larger discrepancy between people who felt that they were schooling at home. So I've heard people call it kitchen table schooling. Kitchen table schooling, right. As well as unschooling or unstructured homeschooling.
Unschooling. What is that exactly? It means you're not following a specific curriculum. Is that right?
Yeah, usually what it means sort of is child-led learning. So there's no imposed curriculum. The understanding is that children are naturally curious, that they want to learn things, that they have many interests, and so the parent will follow whatever interest the child has. If they show an interest in dinosaurs, for example, which is really common with little kids, then you would take them to museums so they could see, you could read books, you could watch a video, so that they sort of become immersed in whatever it is they're interested in, and their interest will grow as they grow.
Okay, now that's unschooling or unstructured schooling as we call it, but parents can also choose, can't they, to follow the government curriculum? It's available where online for them to
Certainly, but we called it structured and unstructured simply because, again, you can have very child-centered learning. We can have it even in the daycares.
Yep.
Concordia is a big fan, actually, of child-centered learning. But you can also say, well, my child is interested in dinosaurs, so tomorrow we're going to, and you can have a plan. So tomorrow we're going to look at all words starting with the letter D, or we're going to, but there's still a plan for the day.
Yeah, you can't be really flying by the seat of your pants. Yeah,
and
definitely.
It can be very sporadic. Yes. So it can also, I had one mother say that her daughter spent a lot of time watching TV and playing video games, and so it can be, the amount of structure varies, and it can be very structured to where the parent is following a bought curriculum or a government curriculum, and they're saying today we're going to do these exact tasks on the one end. On the other end, very unstructured would just be child-led to the point of very little parent
guidance at all.
And just to clarify, in Canada, you can do anything you want. You can decide not to follow a curriculum. You can decide to have your child watching video games all day, and the government won't do anything about it.
Well, education is a provincial. It's covered by the provinces,
okay, let's
right?
talk about Quebec or the Maritimes where you did your research.
In the Maritimes, yes, there was no truancy officer, and under the Freedom of Religion Act, parents are able to educate their kids any way that they see fit. And there, as I understand, there's a wide discrepancy among what parents, how parents see fit to educate. But all of the homes we went into had parents that were loving and caring and interested in their kids, and the environments were certainly child-centered, and I learned a lot as a parent going into the homes and talking with the people. I mean, it was a very wonderful experience for me.
Yeah. Now, Wendi Hadd, you chose not to follow the government curriculum. Why is that?
I just didn't feel the need, really. But I'm very aware of the government curriculum, and I think that most people are, whether they choose to follow it or not, because, now my son is going to CEGEP. I certainly didn't want my children to, reach a certain age and not have any sort of basic knowledge or not be able to hold their own in conversation with somebody else their age. So I'm aware of it, but I didn't follow it sort of, this year we'll do this and next year we'll do that. But always in the back of my mind, I'm keeping an idea of, what does a person need to know to be educated?
Because it was very interesting. You're a teacher yourself.
Yes.
You teach at college here at John Abbott. Isn't it a bit ironic that you decided to turn your back on public education when it comes to your children, but you participate in it yourself in your everyday job?
I don't think so. I think that at a certain age, 17, 18, people are ready for very structured schooling that they've chosen. And so, I mean, I know that a lot of people go to CEGEP without choosing it, in the sense that, you know, they're sort of compelled to go there. But they don't have to be there legally. And so for me, once you've sort of spent your childhood being a child and you've spent your teenage years sort of learning who you are as a person, then it's great. Now it's time for you to go into a structured program and start working to the demands of a curriculum, to the demands of a teacher in the classroom situation. So I don't really feel that it's sort of contradictory, but it's a natural continuum of how I see people learning.
You were going to add something?
Well, I was going to say, I think as we get on in education, it's been my experience anyway, that we become more unstructured. Like, that my students at the university level have more choice.
Yeah.
They have, I mean, they're no longer raising their hand to go to the bathroom. They're, you know, they're given choice in assignments.
More independent.
So in that sense, I can see there's far more choice in, let's say, doing your PhD than there was in grade 1. So
Yeah.
that
Now,
makes
just
sense.
before we get into the results of your research, which I'm very keen to get into, can you take us through a typical day of homeschooling? What's it like? What's the reality of a typical day?
There is no typical day. That's the problem with unstructured homeschooling, is that we have no typical day. It really depends. And now my children are sort of in flux because
So
some
what,
of them
you get up
actually
in the
are
morning and you
using-
say, what do you want to do today? Is that how it works? Or-
they have projects that they're working on. So my oldest daughter, who is 15, has developed this incredible love of mathematics. And I don't know why, because
you don't share that love?
I do, actually. I used to teach statistics, so I kind of but she decided she loved math last year, and so she did, from September to December, she did the grade 9 math curriculum. And then from January to April, she did the grade 10, and now she's going to do a grade 11. So she'll spend easily 3 or 4 hours a day just doing math. But she also has a learning disability, and she reads very poorly. So she also has to spend, and Sandra will probably be really interested in this, because she has difficulty reading. She's reading at a very low level. So she has to spend a couple of hours. She has a tutor, and she has to, So her day is very structured, but she has chosen to structure her day. Whereas the other children, especially the younger ones, they'll play Playmobil for a few hours, or do some Lego, or play a video game, or maybe they don't really watch a lot of TV. They go through periods where they watch too much TV, and right when I'm ready to sort of step in, they usually go do something else for a month or so.
Sandra, Wendi mentioned the reading. That is your specialty, reading in children. For this particular study, did you look specifically at their ability to read after you've tested them, or was counting and other things, were they also included?
We looked at a broad spectrum, at least we tried to, because we wanted to make sure that it was a fair representation. So I didn't want to go in, and it wouldn't have been a very interesting study if I had gone in and looked at only things that they were doing in the formal schooling education, and then come out and said, well, children in formal schooling had done better. That's not a very interesting study. So we wanted to make sure that we had represented certainly the social sciences, and we just tried to, we had looked at 7 main things, but I think reading was overrepresented for the reason that it was a love of mine, it's an interest of mine.
So let's get into the results of those findings. Tell us how the different children performed in the 3 groups. The unschooled children, meaning taught at home with no structure, specific structure or curriculum. The structured homeschools, those whose parents followed the government curriculum, and those who went to public school.
Okay, I'll just clarify one thing. It's not necessarily that the parents were following the government curriculum at all. It's that they followed some sort of curriculum, and often it was self-made.
Okay.
Okay, because sometimes they had bought it, sometimes it was a Christian curriculum, or sometimes the parents had just sat down and said,
what do they need to know?
Let's do a unit on dinosaurs. But it was planned. So they had an idea of what to do.
Some form of structure
planned,
established from the parents.
Well, we had a moderate sample of our structured homeschoolers. So we had 25 formal homeschoolers.
Formal, so those whose
25,
parents established a structure at home.
And then we had a comparison group of children of the same sex and the same age who were attending formal or traditional school.
Public school.
Public school,
Okay.
yes. And we had equated for the mother's education, as well as we had done our best to equate for the mean family income.
Okay.
Although formal, children attending formal public education, they tended to have two working parents, so sometimes the mean level of income was a little bit higher.
Okay.
And what we found in those two groups, and those are the groups I feel most comfortable talking about because we at least had an okay sample, you know. What we found was that the children who had been taught at home were outperforming those going to public school. Yeah.
By how much? Like
Well,
significantly stronger scores.
Significantly stronger scores in 5 out of the 7 areas. And again, this was in spite of the difference in income. And it wasn't even that. If you looked at the children attending public school and you compared them to the mean of the test, it wasn't that they were doing poorly. They weren't doing poorly, these kids, and which makes sense because this was a self-selected population. So these are people who invited us in, and so they were doing well too. Those kids going to public school, they were doing well. But it wasn't that they were doing poorly, it's that the kids being educated at home were really outperforming. In some instances, they were 5 grade levels, you know, higher than those kids being taught in the public school.
Wow. And you tested them, it was a standardized test, and you tested them at what age or after what grade? This is primary, we're talking about primary
Yes,
school
it was
kids.
primary, and we had quite we basically worked with the people who volunteered, so we had quite a spread of ages. So our youngest kids were in kindergarten and our oldest kids were in grade 5.
And then you also looked at the unschooled children, those who didn't have any kind of structure at home. For example, that mother you mentioned who looked at video games, but also some parents who decided they were just gonna get the child itself to decide what they wanted to learn. And what were the results for your standardized tests?
We only had 12 kids. Okay, so it was a very small sample, but having said that, I think it was one of the first studies that looked.
Yeah, I think so.
Because there aren't that many children in the population who learn that way.
Well, or their parents don't volunteer for research, I think is often the case.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And how did those 12 kids perform?
Again, we had a comparison group with kids of the same age and same sex, coming from similar families. And in this case, there was a very small group, but we found a pattern where they weren't performing as highly.
Okay. Significantly
Certainly
lower scores, or?
Certainly significantly lower scores compared to those taught with structure.
Okay.
So we had those taught with structure who were very, very high.
Yeah.
And we had those taught with less structure who were lower. And then we had the public school who was more, you know,
somewhere
in the middle.
between. Okay. That's great. I think, Wendi Hadd, you're familiar with this study, or you've looked at it at least. What do you think about those findings?
This didn't surprise me at all, particularly given the age group that the research was dealing with. And certainly anecdotally, I've seen exactly this, that children who are unschooled tend to be much slower. They read later on, you know, whereas kids who are in the public school system or who are homeschooled in a structured setting will learn to read earlier. It's been my experience with my own children and just with friends who've unschooled that our children tend to start to read later. So they will not read until they're 9, sometimes 10. The thing that I've noticed is that once they start to read, they zoom up really quickly. So instead of, for example, one of my children, when he learned how to read, he didn't sort of progress through baby books or you know, books with small little words, but immediately started reading a novel because he suddenly decided he, you know, should learn how to read.
He knew how to read.
Yeah. So clearly he had been learning how to read just in his daily sort of, you know, interactions with print. You see printed words everywhere in games and on the computer. So he had been sort of mobilizing all of these resources, but hadn't actually used them. And I've noticed that with several of my children, that they read later, but then they became very good readers very quickly. And I've seen it in other things, like mathematics, for example, where they'll be very slow to get going, but then once they decide that they're going to learn it, they'll learn it quickly.
And I think it's important to mention at this point that your research only looked at primary school kids. We don't have equivalent numbers for high school kids. In your case, your kids went through primary school and high school at home, or they didn't go at all through primary school and high school, but so it's difficult for us to compare and to see if maybe, you know, kids would learn very much quicker afterwards.
What we need is longitudinal
I think
research.
that would be
We need to follow the same kids, you know, at multiple points, and then you can look at proper change over time, which is what's needed.
Yes.
However, that is a huge study. It's a very ambitious study, and you would almost need to get the kids before the parents decide. So you would need to follow them from a very young age, and then
group them yourselves. You'll have to be.
You'll
have to have unstructured. You'll be structured.
Well, which we
in
can
order
do.
for it to be
Correct.
perfect.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, it won't be perfect. But ideally, that's what we'd like to do: is look at the same kids over time and look at, you know, their trajectory of learning
and how they progress. Now, just focusing on primary school for now, because that's the research we have. The test you use, the standardized test, it follows, I guess, what kids at that age are supposed to know at school when they learn reading and counting and so on. Is it possible that this sort of standard test doesn't see other forms of intelligence or development that maybe the kids who stay at home acquire and that are not seen in a standard public school test, for example?
Well, one of the things that we did purposefully, again, was we looked at a test that wouldn't have been used in the public school, that wasn't tied to the curriculum in any way, just to make sure it was a fair assessment. And we expected I thought perhaps that there might have been differences in the social sciences and the arts, those types of disciplines, and we didn't find that. What we found was, and again, you could imagine the public school kids might have been better readers, certainly at a younger age. You could imagine that. We didn't find that either. What we found was that those being taught at home with structure, they were better readers, they were better at math, they were better at social science. So they were better in a large number of disciplines.
Now, I guess I keep on hearing this structure. I guess it's very much a gray zone, isn't it? This structure where,
very much.
What is
I mean, you consider yourself unstructured, but you do, you know, your daughter, you said, has herself a very
she's developed structure herself,
for her math, but you've let her develop that herself. Is that the difference you would make between structured and unstructured?
Well, I think, you know, we started off all through primary as very unstructured, and we didn't have workbooks and things like that. But there came a point where they were asking for them. So if I'm going to engage in child-led learning, if my child asks me to have, you know, to enroll in a course or to have a workbook, then I have to go with that as well.
Okay,
but I know people who wouldn't do it.
Right.
That they would just say, no, that's not part of our philosophy of learning. So there are people even more radical than I am.
Now, I want to talk about socializing, because I think it's part of the, one of the things you hear most about is that kids who learn at home don't get to socialize with other kids because they're not at school. What kind of impact, first of all, in your study, have you seen a difference in terms of, I guess, or maybe you didn't specifically look at socialization and it's a whole other field of study, but is this something that you hear a lot as a common sort of stereotype, that kids who learn at home are not as socialized?
It's something that I have heard. We didn't look at it, so I can't comment on it from my research at all, except to say that the kids that we worked with were in a lot of groups. I mean, they did a lot of activities, they were in a lot of groups, and anecdotally, from going to the homes, it seemed like they had their days were longer. They had more time, you know? They had more time to take violin and go to skiing lessons, and there was not this huge chunk of the day that was busy with other things, busy at school.
What would you say about your children and socialization?
Well, as Sandra says, children who are homeschooled tend to be involved in a lot of groups, Girl Guides, Boy Scouts, violin lessons, sports activities. And generally homeschooling families have organizations where they'll meet and go on field trips together. So I know that it's something that people are very concerned about, because our sort of the norm is for children to be in a large group of other children the same age as them. But really, I don't think that's the best place for children to be learning about their, you know, social skills from other children who maybe haven't learned them yet. And I think because they don't spend all of their time with one age group, they tend to develop skills in dealing with people who are older than them, and also in dealing with children who are smaller than them or younger than them. So just from what I've seen, they tend to be very compassionate.
Because the older brothers and sisters are teaching.
Well,
the
and then
younger
if you go
ones.
into any kind of group situation, if we organize a field trip as homeschoolers, we're not all going to be 10. Some of us are going to be 2, and some will be 5, and some will be 14. And so they learn how to work in groups of varying ages. And they spend more time with adults as well, which I think is really important for children, to have adult contact, not just your parents, but other adults around you.
So you've got the phone numbers of other moms who homeschool their children, and you get together and do activities
I used to.
together.
I don't anymore, to be completely honest. My children are not, they have now their set of friends. And when they're little, when children are little, we bring them to play dates and they'll play with whoever we like, right? If I like a person, her kid will be my kid's friend.
Yeah.
But once you're 14 or 15 or 12, you're not necessarily going to be friends with somebody because your mom likes their mom. So we're sort of out of that. Most of my children's friends are schooled. They go to school and they come to our house after school and then do whatever.
How do they react when they come home and they see their friends don't have to go to school the next day?
They're really envious. They really are. And I think it makes them see a lot of their time at school is wasted. In the trying, and I don't mean on purpose, and I don't fault teachers for it, but you're dealing with 25 kids in a class, right?
Yeah.
For a lot of the time, you're going to have to wait while the teacher helps the children, So they do see that.
We've talked about how homeschooling is actually illegal in some countries. Do you think today it's still a very controversial topic from what you hear around you and the people you've met?
Do you think it's controversial?
I think particularly in Quebec it's really controversial.
Why particularly in Quebec?
Other provinces, and I actually don't know many people from the maritime provinces, but I have friends who are homeschooling BC and Alberta and Ontario. They're much more homeschooling friendly. Alberta, you can register as a homeschooler and receive money for your educational supplies.
Interesting.
You can, get textbooks from the school. Quebec doesn't have anything like that. And they tend to be very adversarial with homeschoolers. And so
like how? Adversarial?
Very demanding. They often threaten people who are homeschooling that they're going to report them to the DPG if their children don't come to school or they don't sign a contract.
Have you had that?
No,
Those kind of threats?
No, I've never had them. But other people definitely have. And I think that what happens when they have this adversarial relationship is it drives people underground. And so most of the people I know the school board doesn't even know that they exist. If your child has never been to school, you have no relationship with the school board, and so they don't exist at all.
Which I guess makes it very hard for researchers to be studying on this, to actually find people who will talk.
Definitely, and I think the fact that I wasn't in a Department of Education at the time helped. It helped people come forward.
Because you were in the Department of Psychology.
Yeah. And I didn't know I was going to be going to a Department of Education at the time. But yes, it makes it very difficult because we can't find the base population. Ideally, as I mentioned, in our study, it was self-select population, which means that our results might not be reflective of the general population. People who felt confident, who felt good, who knew their children were doing well, those were the people who were most likely to volunteer for our study. But the good thing about our study was that we had this comparison group, so the same restrictions would apply to those people in public school. It wasn't the ones that were worried about their kids. They weren't inviting us over to their house,
And even
we still found these differences, though.
Yes, I was going to say, even though the parents were very confident, for example, in an unstructured setting where they were teaching, where they were not really teaching their kids, where they decided to leave their kids to sort of learn on their own, the parents felt confident, but still the kids were performing at
some
lower
cases,
levels than the high school kids.
The public
primary
school
kids,
yes. In some cases, I think that was one difference I noticed. I noticed going into the homes. This is all anecdotally, but the public schooled kids, the parents would be off making dinner or cleaning the house or doing something. I mean, they were doing something. The homeschooled parents, we asked them to just not to not make their kids nervous but they would be practically right behind here listening. How are they doing? How are they doing? And in some instances, those being taught without structure were surprised. Like they would say to me, shoot, we've been covering the governmental system in Russia, and I didn't realize that my child didn't know all the letters of the alphabet.
Wow.
Like we just forgot to teach the alphabet.
But they were already learning about politics.
They were learning,
in Russia.
so there were some areas of real
gaps.
Yeah, gaps, exactly. Some areas of real specialized learning, but then there were some foundational skills. And it's very difficult, this coming from a researcher who studies literacy, it's very difficult to learn the letters of the alphabet. We need, in that case, we need some explicit instruction. And so I had another mother who was a wonderful, kind, warm, loving parent. But she said, my daughter takes books to bed every night, trying to teach herself the alphabet.
How did your kids learn the alphabet?
Oh boy, I don't know. Were they just singing, maybe? I honestly can't remember them learning how they learned the alphabet. But we read a lot. We had games where you would use letters. So, as much as we're unstructured, we did things that lead to learning, I think. But I really believe that children have to read and read well in order to accomplish anything at all. So, 2 of my children learned how to read when they were 6. 2 of them didn't learn until one was 9, one was 10. I have a 9-year-old now who, he will read, but he tells people he doesn't know how because he thinks people are going to ask him to read stuff to them. But he plays games where there's a lot of reading.
Or it didn't worry you when he was 10 and still he couldn't.
I was starting to get a little concerned. Absolutely, yeah. But I knew, it's almost like a religious experience. You have to have faith that it's going to work out and they're going to learn it. But I really was encouraging him to pick things up and try to read. But I really did think that he probably would soon. And sure enough, his sister had learned how to read the year before, his twin sister.
Very interesting. I just wonder, can you get equivalence in terms of tests? If they want to go to CEGEP afterwards, how does that work? They don't have a high school degree?
No,
so
he doesn't have a high school degree. They've sort of changed the rules to get into CEGEP in the last 3 or 4 years. When my eldest went to CEGEP, he just went down, made an appointment, went down and talked to them, and they were like, oh, okay. In you go. But that was many, many years ago. My second eldest, he wrote a letter and he prepared sort of some stuff that he had written, sort of a little, promo package for himself. But he also had taken, because he wanted to go to CEGEP last year and he wasn't old enough. So he took a few online courses, grade 12 online courses. So he had those grades as well to sort of back him up.
Okay, so
it really just went on the letter that he wrote.
Right.
And so they called him and spoke to him on the telephone about this letter, what he had been doing.
And that was all his own initiative?
Yeah. I think if you want to go, you need to make the case for yourself that, that you should go.
Sure. Sandra Martin-Chang, I don't know if you saw in your study a certain profile for kids that may be more, how could I put it, that may be just a better profile to be homeschooled compared to others.
We had a very small sample, okay? So I'm not able to answer that question based on the number of kids that we had. With research, what you'd like to do is add a little tiny piece and go, a little tiny piece further than what has been added, and then see if it fits. And what we found does fit within a larger literature from the United States, looking at larger samples, but where they didn't. Is that
where most of the literature comes from?
It's where the literature that we have. Again, there isn't a lot of it, but what's been done, a large part of it has been done in the United States. It's flawed in different ways, but the nice thing is when you get a picture that's kind of consistent from looking at many different methodologies, then you can start feeling a little bit more confident in what you're finding.
Sure.
I will say though that I think whenever I talk to people about my research, there are areas where we can all learn from each other, I think. So right now when I'm training pre-service teachers, We certainly talk to them about allowing lots of choice in our classrooms. We talk to them about getting kids reading authentic literature. A lot of explicit instruction at the beginning, because I think learning the alphabet is very difficult without explicit instruction. But then making things authentic, and so we don't need to have this dichotomy between these artificial worksheets and silly things, these make work
Busy
for the
work
kids,
things.
and necessarily just being completely unstructured, especially in school. We don't want kids unstructured. I don't want kids unstructured with the teacher sitting in the corner doing something else.
And a lot of kids will fall in the cracks if you do that also. That every child is not going to learn to read in the same way. So I think it's important to see, who are we dealing with? Some kids need tons and tons of reinforcement. I mean, you know that, you're a reading specialist.
Exactly.
Whereas others will pick it up relatively quickly. So my older daughter she's had a reading tutor since she was 6. She's still only reading at about a grade 5 level. She has a whole sort of list of accommodations that would be made for her when she goes into CEGEP. I couldn't just let her she'll learn how to read one day, I'll just leave her, she's slow. You can't do that either. You have to be aware. And I knew, and I'm not sure how I knew, but just her pattern with language was very different from her elder brothers. And so I knew when she was 6, something wasn't going to work out for her without some very intense reinforcement.
I think that's a beautiful way to come to an end to this conversation, finding balance between a completely unstructured setting and having the child have some autonomy and some decision making in their learning. I'm going to ask very short questions to each of you, and you can answer in very short answers, 1 or 2 words if possible. We have 1 minute, so let's go. Are you ready?
Go.
Wendi Hadd, if you could do it all over again, would you do it any differently?
No.
Sandra, what is the number 1 misconception about homeschooling, would you say?
I would say probably the socialization.
Okay. Yeah. Wendi, is it harder to find a job when you've been homeschooled?
Not to my understanding.
Sandra, does the Canadian government, or Quebec government rather, encourage or discourage parents to homeschool?
Probably in Quebec, maybe
Sadly.
discourage, but in other provinces it's really left up to the parents' discretion. I think the government is quite neutral.
Okay. Wendi, should all parents be allowed to choose how to teach their kids regardless of the government's curriculum?
Yes.
Same question.
Yes, but we need to get more information to parents, because parents are loving and they want to do what's best for their kids, and we don't have the research right now, I think, necessarily for parents to make informed decisions.
Wendi, why don't more parents homeschool?
I think that you're using schools mostly as a custodial as function, because somebody needs to be at home. It's very costly for a lot of families, and a lot of people feel that they're not competent to do it, and that's fine. If you're not, I have nothing. I don't encourage all parents to homeschool, just like I don't encourage all people to have children. If that's your thing, then that's good.
Sandra, what would you say was the number 1 reason that your structured homeschool kids got higher scores than kids who went to primary public school?
I would say, this is a hypothesis, but I would say the one-on-one instruction and the sensitivity. So that's another thing we encourage in our teachers, is for teachers to really get a sense of how each child in their class is doing, so that you can teach just above it, just beyond what they can do alone. And I think parents working with a smaller number of kids at home have a better idea of exactly where their children stand, and then they can give instruction that's a little bit higher. That would be my guess.
Wendi, what was your biggest challenge homeschooling?
It was really easy.
Wow, that's a nice answer. And Sandra, finally, if you had to do it all over again, would you homeschool your kids?
Oh, no, I wouldn't. However, I am certainly very involved in their schooling. Another misconception is that either you send your kids off to school and you have no idea what they're doing, and some parents do that, and I don't agree with it. Or you keep them at home and then that's all you do is you school them. I think there is a lot of overlap. So if you send your kids to school, which the majority of Canadians will continue to do, we still, have projects with them, do things with them, take them places, read the books they're reading, be involved, you know. And the teachers at school, it should be a community.
Sandra Martin-Chang and Wendi Hadd, thank you very much for coming in today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, and join us soon for another Beyond the Headlines. I'm Caroline Locker. Till next time.